Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Grandmaster Knockout. In the left corner, the one, the only, Firouzja. And his opponent, ladies and gentlemen, Niemann. Tonight, one board, 64 squares, playing white. Firouzja, playing black. Niemann, gentlemen, let the battle begin. Firouzja, knight to f3. Niemann, knight to f6. Firouzja, pawn to b3. Niemann, pawn to d5. Firouzja, bishop to b2. Niemann, bishop to f5. Firouzja, pawn to d3. Niemann, pawn to h6. Firouzja, knight to bd2. Niemann, pawn to e6. Firouzja, pawn to e4. Niemann, bishop to h7. Firouzja, pawn takes d5. Niemann, knight takes d5. Firouzja, pawn to a3. Niemann, knight to f6. Firouzja, pawn to g3. Niemann, bishop to e7. Firouzja, bishop to g2. Niemann, castles kingside. Firouzja, castles kingside. Niemann, knight to bd7. Firouzja, rook to a1. Niemann, pawn to a5. Firouzja, knight to c4. Niemann, pawn to c6. Firouzja, queen to d2. Niemann, rook to e8. Firouzja, pawn to h3. Niemann, knight to d5. Firouzja, knight to f5. Niemann, knight takes a5. Firouzja, knight takes a5. Niemann, bishop to f6. Firouzja, rook to add 1. Niemann, queen to c7. Firouzja, pawn to c4. Niemann, knight to e7. Firouzja, pawn to d4. Niemann, knight to f5. Firouzja, knight to g4. Niemann, bishop to g5. Firouzja, queen to c3. Niemann, rook to add 8. Firouzja, pawn to h4. Niemann, bishop to e7. Firouzja, pawn to d5. Niemann, bishop to f8. Firouzja, bishop to e4. Niemann, pawn to f6. Firouzja, queen to f3. Niemann, pawn takes d5. Firouzja, pawn takes d5. Niemann, pawn to h5. Firouzja, knight to h2. Niemann, knight to h6. Firouzja, pawn takes a6. Niemann, rook takes d1. Firouzja, queen takes d1. Niemann, bishop takes a4. Firouzja, rook takes a4. Niemann, queen to c6. Firouzja, queen to e2. Niemann, pawn to f5. Firouzja, rook to e5. Niemann, bishop to d6. Firouzja, rook takes a5. Niemann, bishop to c5. Firouzja, queen to e5. Niemann, bishop to f8. Firouzja, queen to d5. Niemann, rook takes a 6. Firouzja, queen takes c6. Niemann, pawn takes c6. Firouzja, pawn to b4. Niemann, rook to e1, check. Firouzja, king to g2. Niemann, pawn to f4. Firouzja, pawn takes f4. Niemann, rook to e4. Firouzja, bishop to e5. Niemann, knight to f5. Firouzja, knight to f3. Niemann, bishop to e7. Firouzja, rook to a7. Niemann, king to f8. Firouzja, rook to c7. Niemann, rook to c4. Firouzja, king to h3. Niemann, pawn to g6. Firouzja, rook to c8, check. Niemann, king to f7. Firouzja, bishop to h8. Niemann, rook takes f4. Firouzja, knight to e5, check. Niemann, king to e6. Firouzja, knight takes g6. Niemann, rook to f3, check. Firouzja, king to g2. Niemann, rook takes a 3. Firouzja, rook takes c6, check. Niemann, king to d7. Firouzja, knight to e5, check. Niemann, king to d8. Firouzja, knight to g6. Niemann, knight takes h4, check. Firouzja, knight takes h4. Niemann, bishop takes h4. Firouzja, rook to c5. Niemann, bishop to e7. Firouzja, rook to d5, check. Niemann, king to c8. Firouzja, pawn to b5. Niemann, pawn to h4. Firouzja, bishop to e5. Niemann, rook to b3. Firouzja, bishop to f4. Niemann, bishop to d8. Firouzja, bishop to e3. Niemann, bishop to c7. Firouzja, rook to h5. Niemann, king to b7. Firouzja, king to f1. Niemann, pawn to h3. Firouzja, rook takes h3. Niemann, rook takes b5. Firouzja, rook to h6. Niemann, king to c8. Firouzja, rook to h7. Niemann, king to d8. Firouzja, king to e2. Niemann, bishop to d6. Firouzja, king to d3. Niemann, king to e8. Firouzja, bishop to d4. Niemann, rook to a5. Firouzja, king to f4. Niemann, bishop to c5. Firouzja, rook to h5. Niemann, bishop to b4. Firouzja, rook to h8, check. Niemann, king to f7. Firouzja, rook to h7, check. Niemann, king to e6. Firouzja, rook to h6, check. Niemann, king to f7. Firouzja, pawn to f4. Niemann, bishop to f8. Firouzja, rook to h7, check. Niemann, king to e8. Firouzja, pawn to f5. Niemann, rook to a2. Firouzja, pawn to f6. Niemann, rook to e2, check. Firouzja, king to f5. Niemann, rook to e1. Firouzja, rook to a7. Niemann, bishop to d6. Firouzja, bishop to c3. Niemann, rook to e2. Firouzja, rook to b7. Niemann, rook to e3. Firouzja, bishop to d4. Niemann, rook to e2. Firouzja, bishop to c3. Niemann, rook to e3. Firouzja, bishop to d2. Niemann, rook to e2. Firouzja, pawn to f7, check. Niemann, king to d8. Firouzja, bishop to a5, check. Niemann, king to c8. Firouzja, rook to c7, check. Niemann, king to b8. Firouzja, rook to d7. Niemann, rook to f2, check. Firouzja, king to a6. Niemann, bishop to a3. Firouzja, bishop to c7, check. Niemann, king to c8. Firouzja, bishop to a5. Niemann, rook to h2. Firouzja, bishop takes h2. Firouzja lands the knockout. Niemann has no answer. If you loved this fight, smash that like button and subscribe. More legendary battles are coming your way. See you in the next one.